When people think of venture capital and startup funding, they usually think about California, specifically Silicon Valley. While these traditional spots have been known for the top startups and unicorns, innovation, as we know, is everywhere. And tonight we have the privilege of hearing from two distinguished leaders who have built transformative, literally life-saving businesses through uncommon paths. With that, I'd like to introduce Tina Daheley from BBC, who will moderate a conversation between Stéphane Bancel, CEO of Moderna, and Jason Kelly, the CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks.
Stéphane, Jason, it's great to see you both and great to be in conversation with you. The last few years have been a truly extraordinary time in history for the world, for biotech, and for each of your organizations. Can you tell us about the moment that you knew you could contribute to solving the COVID-19 crisis? Stéphane.
The first one is when I heard there's a new virus in China, and we had already done 9 vaccines in clinical studies. And when I heard it was a coronavirus, we already had worked on MERS. So I knew there was a very high probability our vaccine could work and be helpful. But at that time, we thought it was going to be an outbreak. I'm going back, December of 2019. And at the end of January, when I was actually in Davos with Jason, he and I had lunch with Angela Merkel. It's during that week that I realized it was going to be a pandemic like 1918. And so we started running for our lives and pivoted the whole company because we thought it was going to be really bad.
Stéphane, can you remember a particular moment that when you had that realization? What happened?
Yes, I was with Dr. Jeremy Farrar, who ran the Wellcome Trust, and Richard Hatchett, who runs CEPI, both amazing infectious disease doctors. We're having a coffee because we will meet several times a day to check all the new information that we get out of China. And I remember that as we saw the cases going up, and if you remember, the Chinese government closed Wuhan during the Davos meeting, and we realized that there were already cases popping up, in Southeast Asia, in Japan, and that there are flights to every capital in Asia, every capital in Europe, and all the big cities on the west coast of the US. And I remember looking up to Jeremy and remind me, coronavirus, it's around 7-10 days incubation. He's like, yep. And so I told him, so it's everywhere. And he's like, yep, it's everywhere. And so this is why I told him this is going to be like 1918. He's like, yep, it's going to be like 1918.
We weren't around in 1918, but can you tell us, Jason, about your recollections, where you were when you realised this was as serious as it was?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was sort of like many folks. It was around when things exploded in Italy. We're Ginkgo's not a vaccine company. We weren't sort of frontline in that way. What we saw was a biological event that was going to be 1918 scale. And it seemed like people hadn't fully accepted that yet. And it felt like our community, the biotech community, should sort of throw in to help however we can, basically, right? Like, imagine it had been a computer virus. You don't think the Apples and Googles of the world would have sat it out, right? We sort of had a view at Ginkgo that we should help however we can. And so we basically opened our platform up to do free work for folks working in therapeutics and vaccines to help where we could. And that was in basically March and April 2020 that we started doing that. And then ultimately that led to some of the work we're doing in testing. It led to some of the work we've been doing in the vaccine supply chain. But it was really just a recognition that it was the biological event of our lives, and you ought not sit it out.
Just a quick thought from you both on what that was like when the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, was in denial. What it was like for you to be pressing ahead with your plans and your thoughts on how to tackle this, Stéphane.
So internally, everybody was realigned very quickly. So the internal piece was easy. The piece that was hard for us until I think around April was to get some financial help. Moderna, people forget now. But in January 2020, Moderna was a phase 1 company. We've never run a phase 2 or phase 3, never sold a product. We had made for all of 2019, 100,000 vials for clinical trials. And I told my team in at the end of January, we need to make $1 billion for 21. So as you can imagine, they look at me a bit funny. And the thing that was really hard for us is we had no money. We could not even fund, with all the cash we had, we could not even fund the phase 3. And so while we got the US government moving pretty quickly, but still we wasted a month or two, the piece we couldn't get any help from any government in the world or any big foundation in the world in Q1 and Q2 of 2020 was to help build manufacturing. And that has resulted in many, many lives that have been lost, because as we had to ramp the manufacturing, but much later than we could have started, the result, even at the launch of a product, if you think about it, we shipped $20 million to the US government the day we got authorization by the FDA. If we had started building manufacturing earlier, I think we would have shipped 100 million doses that same day. And it was just a delay of getting funding that was the biggest frustration.
Jason?
I would agree on this sort of manufacturing bit. I mean, that's one of our general expertise is sort of in trying to optimize biotech manufacturing. I think people aren't used to that being the hard part of a drug, right? In normal therapeutics development, it's all about whether you can, have success in the clinical trial and is it going to work? But it's just, you don't have something that hits the entire world at the same time like this. And so it's actually, manufacturing was, from my perspective, one of the biggest issues. Yeah.
Now, we understand that Ginkgo and Moderna came together to support process optimization for Moderna's COVID-19 response. How did that come together?
So as Jason explained, exactly like you explained it, which is one day he emailed me or called me. We've known each other for many years. And he's like, we want to be helpful. How can I be helpful? And he's like, I'll do it for free. And so I just talked to the manufacturing team right away. And we thought there could be some optimization on how do we make the plasmid, which is a piece of DNA we use to make the mRNA from, where if we could get a better yield, we could make more doses out of the system. And this was really into Ginkgo's alley. And so the team went working on that right away. It was based on Jason's leadership.
The path to this extraordinary moment, a crazy marathon, as you've described it, Stéphane, but the path wasn't straight and it wasn't straightforward. Stéphane, can you tell us about building a business at the bleeding edge of science?
So the first 5-7 years were really hard because most people believed that this was not doable. You can even go back to the media and Google Moderna mRNA. If you look at the 2013, 14, 15 timeframe, most people thought that we were nuts. It was actually really hard to recruit people because when you get a good scientist from MIT or Harvard and you tell them we're going to make mRNA drugs, they'll say, you're going to do what? We're going to take in people mRNAs, we're going to make their own drugs. You're going to do what? And so the first years were really hard, a lot of naysayers. But the reason we kept going is we always said, look, if we can find a way to make this work safely, it will change medicine forever. And so we said, we'd rather be wrong and take a 5% chance to do something that could change medicine forever. And I'm meaning forever, versus taking, a 90% shot to build an average, single drug biotech company, which by the way is most probably not going to work. And so I think that's what's really kept us going, is this belief that if we could find a path, it was going to change medicine forever.
In particular, I was just going to say, go on, Jason, you go first.
No, Tina, please. Yeah.
No, I was just going to, following on from that, and hold that thought, Jason. In particular, how did you approach building Moderna in a way that was different to building a typical venture business?
I think we always adapt to the science. What was very clear to us, because it's molecular biology, which Jason loves as well, is that it was either not going to work or it was going to work in a lot of drugs.
Yeah.
It made no scientific sense to us. It was going to work for one drug. And so because as an entrepreneur, you don't work hard to build a company assuming it's going to fail, it actually made it very simple for us from a strategic standpoint, which is we assume it was going to work massively. And so from the beginning, we invested a lot in IT, in robotics. We built the company for scale, which is why now we have 30 plus program in development. Soon we're going to have 50. And then a couple of years after, we're going to have 100, which for any biotech company thinks like it's not possible. But that's what has helped us. The other piece is we looked a lot to the tech world in terms of thinking platform. And we built the company as a platform company, which again, I think very few biotech companies have ever done, if any, before us. I know Jason is working hard to build that company as a platform too. And you just think differently. Sometimes you would invest a lot of money, I'm talking 10, 20, $30 million on something that might take 3 to 4 years to happen. But if you get it work, the impact forever on all the things you do is gigantic because it's a platform. And so it's just a different mindset that sometimes I have to educate even my board, because some board members will say, why are you spending so much money there, including IT and robotics? I'm like, because the company I want to build, we want to build, cannot scale if we don't do those investments now. It just, the math doesn't work.
Yeah.
Jason, go.
I was just going to say, I mean, yeah, that was what I was going to mention. Was that I think what's unique is the platform nature, right? Like that people don't realize this, but the biotech industry in particular is extraordinarily product focused. They have like it's like this one drug, right? And we've seen in the tech industry the success of horizontal platforms and the scale they can get to. And I think what Stéphane's building at Moderna, what we're trying to do at Ginkgo is horizontal platform technology that gets better with scale. And if it's successful, I think it does open the door for a biotech industry that feels and looks and has the scale that's more like the tech industry. And, I'm curious if you agree with this, Stéphane, but like, I also feel like COVID has been this like incredible educator to the general public about, for example, the fact that DNA and RNA are code, right? That you can read it and write it like you read and write software code. And then you can program, in Moderna's case, the cells in your own body to do things, right? And like code is a flexible thing, right? Like the reason the tech industry looks the way it does is because it runs on digital code. That's why you see horizontal platforms like AWS and Windows and all these things, because at the end of the day, inside the computer's zeros and ones, it's common code. Well, biology works the same way. Where are the platform companies, right? And honestly, they're here in Boston, right? Like it's happening, and I think COVID is this. It's an accelerant. It's going to make it happen, and I think that's new for biotech.
And to build on Jason's point, I think there's another piece, which is the probability of the drugs to get to the finish line. The world has learned last year that mRNA or molecular biology can go really fast. Yes. Nobody believed us when we say we have a vaccine by the end of the year.
Great point.
But the piece that the world has not understood yet, in my opinion, is because you use the same building blocks, because it's like code to do everything you do. The probability of technical success of a drug to launch is going to be massively transformed. I have said before, and I'll say it again today, I believe that 70, 80% of our drugs will get to market. I don't believe there's any pharma CEO who can say that to his or her pipeline, because all the drugs are like analog bits and pieces. They have nothing in common. All our vaccines use the same chemistry, the same manufacturing process, the same lipid. The only difference is the order of the zeros and ones of life, the 4 letters of life, stitched together. That's it. It's the same.
Yeah. COVID has accelerated change in so many areas of our lives, and our collective experience over the past 18 months, 2 years has pulled into question, into much sharper focus, our long-standing assumptions about place and space. How do you both think about the importance of place and community in building your firms going forward? Jason?
Particularly for these like areas of high technology, you do see clustering of talent, right? And so I still think that's going to be particularly important. The thing I'll just note, I think there is a moment where, as a consequence of COVID, you had a awareness of people of like the real world, like the non-virtual world can come into your life, in this case, in a very negative way. And I think with climate change, people are also, this new generation is very concerned about how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to, produce energy? These are all things that honestly, the tech industry doesn't have the tools for in the way that, biotech and other like hard technology industries do. And so I think you're going to see these like centers of excellence. Boston happens to be one for biotech, but around, could be robotics, it could be nuclear, it could, right? And those are going to be the next generation of big companies, in my opinion, because our challenges coming up are in the physical world.
Yes, I agree with what Jason said. I also think that for growth company where you have to invent the future, the world is still going to need to spend a lot of time together physically. So while I think, remote tools are fantastic and They have made all of our life easier, and sometimes you can do something remotely and manage better your work and your life, because sometimes you might need to be a different location. You can still do most of the things. But the piece I will always caution people, which is for the creative process of building. This is really hard to do it in this setup. I'm sure smart engineers are going to invent better tools and so on. But a lot of things we do, and I'm sure it's the same with Jason and his team, is we invent the future every day. And it's really hard to do it in this setup. Sometimes we need to be in the same room, take a pen, work on the board, and build on each other. And then you take my pen and that creative process is still, with the tools I've tried so far, not as good as being in the same room. So I think I would just caution entrepreneurs that I think the world where you can move everything virtually in biology and in a cutting edge of a new science, I think is risky.
Okay. One of the key themes tonight is that diversity, inclusive of geography, is critical to a more impactful next step for the startup and venture landscape. Jason, do you agree?
I think this is particularly important when it comes to thinking about like the folks who build the technologies in these companies, actually. So if you look at the big tech companies today, you have these platforms that were kind of built, they've gotten huge scale, and they're having actually quite a, like sort of negative impacts on the world. And the question is, like, could they have seen it coming? Right? Could Facebook have seen it coming? Right? And I think one of the ways you get around that, you see around corners, is you make sure the team that's building the technology comes from lots of geographies, lots of different backgrounds, right? Because they have more sense of how it might negatively impact a part of the world or an underrepresented group or whatever it may be negatively, right? Because they've lived it. And I think that actually is really important in the folks that act, because you end up embedded in the technology you build. And so that's something we do think about a lot at Ginkgo. When it comes to where you build these companies, I think you'll see them pop up, like I said, all over the place. Certainly at Ginkgo, our platform we make available to startups all over the world. But in general, I do think it's important to think carefully about building a team with diverse backgrounds for that reason.
And to that point as well, would you agree that it's also the responsibility of governments who perhaps haven't anticipated the growth of these companies, and so they haven't been able to regulate in time, that their growth has outpaced regulation?
I think the relationship between the regulatory bodies and the companies should be a lot healthier, in my view. I think people should be getting involved earlier, particularly in emerging new technologies, so they have a better sense of it. It's one of the things I think, as a consequence of COVID, you are seeing a big trial run of basically biosecurity technology being built right now that I'm actually hopeful makes for a safer future when it comes to the development of biotech. But yeah.
Stéphane, your thoughts on that?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, if you look, one of the reasons we could get the vaccine out so fast was an amazing collaboration with the FDA, because we had to. It was COVID, it was a pandemic. But could we have been, in collective way, better prepared? I think so. The piece that is clear in business is, I mean, if you think about it, my team, has dreams and nightmares about mRNA. We have seen thousands of experiments. We have seen now, 20 plus clinical trials. And so we have an asymmetry of information that is gigantic with the FDA. We're trying to do the best we can to do, scientific seminar at the FDA that are not product related, but science related, to teach the science and so on. But I think there's much more we need to do with the regulators, to your point, because the regulator needs to understand what's coming, not what is here today. And that's a piece where I think the need for public-private partnership needs to be really strong. And it means also that from a government standpoint, the regulatory agencies need to invest the time and the resources to learn the science so that they can be better prepared when they see a specific product file coming their way.
If we are to think about building Google-sized businesses outside of Silicon Valley, what are the uncommon approaches or partnerships that we might need to do that, Jason?
I think it's honestly, the first step is to have the ambition to build it, right? I think that's a lot of the magic of Silicon Valley. They're not afraid of building $1 trillion company. They're not afraid of the scale that things could grow into if they're successful at the scale of ambition they're swinging for. I honestly think that is the most important bit there. But I'd be curious, Stéphane, what you think?
Now, I would agree 100% with Jason. we talked about it a lot with the board as we build the board. Even initially building the board was hard. Why?
Yeah.
Because most people you have in town, they don't want drug company.
Yeah.
And as we talk about the platform, it's just different mindset, different time scale, different risk profile, different understanding of not only biology, but also technology, i.e. software, AI, robotics, and so on.
Yes.
And I think what was hard for us in the early days, I think we're in a good place now, is to find people around the company that could have the right mindset, as Jason says. Because, when I remember in the early days, we say, how do we get to 50 drugs in the clinic? People will look at us and say, what? No biotech company has built 50 drugs in the clinic. So why could you? And that's exactly the wrong mindset, because when you constrain yourself, you cannot invent the future.
And the only thing I'd add is great technologists, we see this again and again with scientists and engineers, they're skeptics, right? It's hard to be a good scientist and not be like an unbelievable skeptic, right? Because the work you're doing is at that leading edge. Most of it's not going to work. And that works against you when you're like, oh, we're gonna pull this off at this huge scale. And so like creating that culture that allows for really great scientists who have that skepticism and care, but also are swinging ambitiously, the amount of input energy needed to maintain is crazy. But if you pull it off, it's a big deal. Yeah.
And finally, your thoughts on, and I think I can predict the answer to this question, do you think biotech companies will become $1 trillion companies similar to the likes of the big tech firms, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook? Jason, you kick off first.
I think the problems coming, for this next generation are all in the physical world. And I think as you look at climate change, it's going to be the same thing. It's not going to come out of tech.
Stéphane, your thoughts on how biotech companies can deal with some of the biggest challenges humanity faces going forward, and will they become $1 trillion companies like the tech players?
So I said it publicly, and I believe it. I believe Moderna will become the biggest life science company. A company like Ginkgo might pass us on the way, or after that, highly possible. And to be very humble about it.
mRNA and DNA, I'm happy to support. But
if you think again how the pharma industry is set up as a bunch of analog drugs, again, this industry has done wonderful. I grew up in this industry. I worked for an amazing company, which is Eli Lilly. But it's like looking at Blockbuster and Netflix. Just nothing in common, but providing you movies. That's the only commonality between Netflix and Blockbuster from a business standpoint, from either to create a product. And it's the same thing with us and the pharmaceutical industry. So if I'm correct to say that I believe 70-80% of our drugs will get to market, the scale that this company is going to have and the ability to reinvest in science, because remember in pharma, 90% of the investment in R&D goes into the child driver. It drives zero value. If you get to a world where 70-80% of your investment in R&D drives to product, and you can reinvest that in R&D and do it again because you're a platform. Think if you can think 5, 10, 15 years out, the scale that this company will have, it's unthinkable for traditional companies. And that's what I think we are saying with Jason, which is biology is moving to a digital world. Yeah. This industry for 150 years has been an analog industry. And like we've seen so many industries from retail to movies to anything, when you move it from analog to digital, you change entirely the game. And I believe the game has been changed in biotech. And now it's just a question of time. People who think, in weeks and quarters won't see exponential growth, but people who think in years and decades, as you start with a bit of analysis, you can fall from your chair very easily.
Jason, Stéphane, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.